Okay, well, I'm Jim McCarthy with American Vapor Manufacturers, and we are very, very pleased to have today esteemed journalist Jacob Grier. Jacob writes about tobacco, public policy, and other vices. Widely published author in places like Slate, Reason, The Atlantic, Washington Post, and long list of others, and has written a number of excellent books, which we will put in our social media thread, which include Smoking, Vaping, and the Creative Destruction of the Cigarette. Another terrific book that I refer to all the time, which is Cocktails on Tap, The Art of Mixing Spirits and Beer. And he has a new book out, which is called The New Prohibition, The Dangerous Politics of Tobacco Control. So, Jacob, thank you very much. And there it is, visual plug. That's right. Well done.
Have the visual.
Exactly. Let me start there, Jacob. Ask what was the inspiration, impetus of the book? How did you decide to write it, and how did that come together?
You know, it's kind of funny because I wrote my previous book, The Rediscovery of Tobacco, back in 2019. And the story I told myself when I was writing that book was, you know, I've been covering tobacco policy for years, and I'm going to put it in a book, and then I can kind of move on. Like I'll have said everything I need to say in this book, and maybe I won't write about it so much after the book comes out. And I could not have been more wrong, as it turns out. That came out in 2019. The past few years have obviously been extremely eventful in tobacco and nicotine policy. I ended up doing a lot more writing on the topic. And so towards the end of last year, I realized that I actually had enough new articles and things that I'd written that were thematically connected by this idea of how we're moving from sort of a regulatory approach to tobacco to a more prohibitionist approach to really have enough for a new book. And so, yeah, I made the decision that, you know, instead of having these pieces scattered all over the web in different articles, in different publications, it would make sense to bring them all together in one volume. And so that's what I came up with. It's a pretty short, approachable book. I wrote a brand new introduction for it, so there's some new content there. But yeah, it's I think we need to bring attention to this idea that we are moving in a more prohibitionist direction, and this will have unintended consequences. And so that was my motivation for the book.
How's the rollout going so far?
It's exceeding my expectations, which is good. You know, it is a niche public policy book. It's self-published. I'm not expecting Harry Potter-like sales here. But, you know, my fear was always that this would do nothing. And it's actually done pretty well. It's getting sales in multiple countries, which is great to see. And it's going steady. So, yeah, still trying to get the word out. So appreciate you having me on to do a podcast like this. But yeah, the response has been very positive so far. So it's been gratifying.
We will be sure to trumpet it far and wide. And, you know, we noticed a similar thing when Noah Rothman's book came out recently, The New Puritans, that there seems to be a kind of, I don't know, a reservoir of people who are thinking about prohibition, regulatory issues in that way, but just have no authors or few columnists, so few voices are articulating this kind of widely held perspective on it. And I have a hunch that your book is kind of resonating in that same way. Do you sense that too?
Well, you know, it's been most popular with people in our space of who are interested in tobacco policy and you know, harm reduction. So yeah, trying to get it out more. We got to do a great podcast that actually just came up today with Richard Morrison at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So that'll hopefully bring it out to that larger audience as well of people who are interested in, you know, liberal economic ideas.
I noticed you tweeted something the other day that you just touched on. You said this was talking about how smoking bans, you know, don't stop. And you wrote, some of us warned for years that the enthusiasm for smoking bans would not stop when all the plausible externalities were addressed. As predicted, outright prohibition is advancing as the policy goal. Tell us a little bit more about that thought.
Yeah, you know, I've been covering this, you know, tobacco use for a really long time, like going back to around, I want to say 2005, 2006, which is also when smoking bans in bars and restaurants became very popular as a policy matter. And I really think that, especially for people who are just now getting into these issues, maybe from a harm reduction standpoint, you can't understand how we got where we are if you don't go back and read up on the smoking ban debates from the 1990s and early 2000s. Because really, a lot of the same techniques and strategies were in play, and often even the same people. And so, regardless of how you feel about smoking bans, and I've written many times about how I'm glad for the direction that we've gone in. That we're not surrounded by tobacco smoke all the time, but the means by which we've gotten here have been problematic. And the way we passed these smoking bans was by a lot of bad science and exaggerated science about what the harms of secondhand smoke could be, and by just completely disregarding any rights of smokers to have spaces of their own or to have liberties of their own. Those just got written out of the conversation. And so I think we're seeing the same thing happen with vaping. And like when the debates over vaping started coming out, it was clearly just a repeat of what we'd done 10 years before with debates on secondhand smoke. And I think it's really an indictment of the field of tobacco control in that they didn't say anything about a lot of science that was obviously bad and exaggerated because it was aligned with their political goals to let it go. And so I think that made the field kind of relax its standards in terms of what it allowed. And people who didn't say anything then are now having to deal with the consequences of creating these low standards in the field, which we see on vaping. And like I will say the probably about the only exception to this is Michael Siegel in Boston, who is a fantastic blogger through this era of exaggerated secondhand smoke and now an advocate for harm reduction on vaping. He's one of the only ones who was actually ahead of the curve and realizing where the field was going.
He was our preceding guest on this very podcast, so it's
there we go.
serendipitous you would mention him.
Right.
Well, let's talk about that for a little bit deeper for a second, because I've noticed the same thing about kind of the history of the way the progressive movement zeroes in on these different aspects of social control. And you can look back at some of their enthusiasms in the past, all the way to alcohol prohibition, for example, or even, the eugenics movement, if you want to talk wide aperture. But if you come more recently, that same thread, I think, of I want to call it progressive social control. You correct me if you think that's inaccurate, but it manifests in other things too, like Tipper Gore's Parents Music Resource Council, or the growth of all the groups that spun out of Ralph Nader's Public Citizen, like Center for Science and the Public Interest, that went after everything from baby food, popcorn, soft drinks, pizza, beer commercials, Girl Scout cookies. And you can look back on those in retrospect, as I think most Americans do about alcohol prohibition, and realize, hey, wait a second, that was ridiculously overreaching, contrary to our common values of individual liberty, completely disastrous as a matter of practical public policy, and maybe even just kind of flat out dumb. I mean, you look at some of the records that Tipper Gore wanted to ban, and it's beyond ludicrous. The fiction writer couldn't make it up. And yet today, this same kind of mania is afflicting a group of what ought to be sober clinical scientists who are careful and measured. And there seems to be no reflection or even worry that maybe the path they're on, has a lot of the same fatal conceits that previous its predecessor prohibition movements had.
Yeah, there's a great recent book on that I'd actually recommend by historian Mark Schrad. It's called Smashing the Liquor Machine. Really fantastic book covering the era of the global temperance movements in the United States and abroad.
Right.
And one of his main points is that, when we think of prohibitionists today, we think of like rural Protestants who just hate people having fun and wanting to restrict drinking, which, there was an element of that, but really it was a progressive movement.
Right.
And the people who pushed for alcohol prohibition,
Yeah.
they didn't talk about restricting people's liberties. They talked about how they were enhancing liberty by shutting down the exploitative liquor traffic.
Yeah.
And we can look back in hindsight and see what was wrong with these policies. But if you look at the language that's used,
Yeah.
it very much reflects how progressives talk about tobacco today.
Yeah.
Where
There was an interesting thread took place a few days ago in Vape World. I don't know if you saw, but it was about how uh, um one of our leading voices said, I wouldn't be opposed to parents against vaping if it was, parents against underage vaping. The way that there's, it's mothers against drunk driving, focuses on, protecting kids. But in fact, there's overlap there too. Like, mothers against drunk driving in their own documentation sought to emulate tobacco-free kids in their policy leverage and in their ultimate goals and in their political strategy. I mean, there is a through line between all of these movements that connects I hate to pull out the cork board here, but, Center for Science and the Public Interest, Ralph Nader's outfit, Tipper Gore. I mean, all of those share this progressive impulse to try to, how would you put it, control what fellow Americans can read, see, consume, enjoy.
Yeah, and I think part of the challenge on this is, there are those elements of progressivism that have always been there, where they're very skeptical of capitalism, and they have a very technocratic mindset where they think with the right experts in charge, like for example at the FDA, we can wisely guide people towards the right choices and take the right things off the market and put the right things on. But there also are other elements of progressivism that care a lot about bodily autonomy. And we see this with most other drugs. Like we've seen this with cannabis legalization. We're seeing it now with psychedelics,
Right.
with harm reduction on opioids. We see it with abortion. We see it with the freedom to change your gender. There are deep threads in progressivism that recognize that people have liberty over their own bodies. And so I think part of our challenge in the tobacco harm reduction space is to make them think about tobacco and nicotine in this light, in the light of bodily autonomy and people's freedom to make their own decisions, rather than in the technocratic way of needing to restrict things.
We've got a thread in one of our AVM greatest hits threads about exactly that. Here's 20 reasons why the progressive caucus should cotton to the vape movement, and includes all that and more, like entrepreneurs and helping low-income minority Americans take control of their own health destiny. It's more affordable, and on and on.
Yeah, if you believe in the slogan "My body, my choice," then it becomes self-evidently ridiculous to say an adult can't buy a strawberry-flavored e-cigarette.
Well, listen. I mean, the PR guy in me is tempted to ask you. You live in Portland, Oregon, one of the great meccas for progressivism in America, and I'm curious to know how your fellow Portlandians react to your own advocacy and view on this, just in ordinary interaction. Are they open-minded about it, or is there a reflexive hostility?
I would say ordinary people tend to be very skeptical of these vape bans, especially when I mean, most of them don't think about it, but if it comes up in conversation, I think most people want to see reasonable regulations in place, but they also believe that people should have the right to do certain things with their body, make their own decisions. So they're glad that there's not smoking in the restaurants they go to, but they think there should be cigar bars. They think it should be legal to have that. They think there should be hookah lounges. That if you want to go to a hookah lounge, you should be able to do that as a consenting adult. That seems to be the attitude among, we'll say, normal people, and then there's the not normal people who are activists in tobacco control and who are in government, who tend to be much more restrictive, and they totally ignore any of these considerations.
It's funny. I live in the other great progressive bastion, New York City, and they're not quite as tolerant here. I got in huge trouble recently. I was picking my daughter up at her school, and I was waiting across the street from the entrance to the school, and I was vaping. And some of the moms saw this, and I learned later from my nanny whisper network that the moms are very angry that I was vaping within eyesight of the children. So,
Oh yeah. No, I had the reverse experience here a while back. I was having a cigar on a bar patio, and someone came out who had been there and like smelled the smoke, and
oh,
they just said, "Hey, I just wanted to thank you for smoking this cigar because I don't like smoking, but I love the smell of cigars. So keep
right.
at it." Like, oh, thank you. Yes, I'm happy to provide this service.
That's funny. Yeah. Well, New York City may be losing its tolerant street cred, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, Let me ask a little bit more about the book. You know, you said something that really struck me when I read it, which was that you argue it's hard to make a case for vapors when you quote don't view their autonomy as worthy of respect. What do you tell me a little more about what your idea is there?
Oh, it's the idea that people view vaping debate only in terms of we must do something to save the children,
Yeah.
uh, and they don't care at all about adults' freedom to make the choice to vape or to vape with flavors, and that's totally inconsistent with how we treat other products. I mean, especially here in Oregon, like we're in a pretty egregious example. One, we're one of the first states to legalize recreational cannabis, and we have stores all over the state of Oregon selling brightly colored, candy flavored cannabis gummies and like every kind of winking childlike reference you can put on a cannabis product. Like we've got it, and nobody's upset about that. And we're also one of the biggest alcohol producers in the country in terms of having more breweries per capita than I think anywhere else in the United States. We've got
Is that
tons of
right?
distillers, and nobody's out here saying, "Oh, we can't have this, donut flavored stout,"
Right. Right.
or
Yeah.
all these, flavored alcohols. Like nobody blinks an eye at that or bats an eye at that. And but yeah, but with nicotine, it's just the one exception. People forget everything they know about drug policy, and they don't care about adults at all.
Well, how much of that though do you think is a function of the coordinated public policy campaign that's gone in, being funded by folks like Robert Wood Johnson, Gates Foundation, Bloomberg Philanthropies, of course? I mean, it looks to me, again, sort of through my PR clinician's eyes, that those groups, some years ago made a very concerted, deliberate, strategic effort to, buy out or ingratiate themselves financially with Lung Association, Heart Association, Cancer. They put up a whole array of front groups, some existing, some new. And they're even, to my absolute, we'll talk a little more about this in a bit perhaps, but the outright payola to journalism outlets, which is mind bending to me. But that all looks to me like a manufactured, concerted public campaign that has been in its own terms pretty successful in orienting attitudes about this issue in the way that you describe.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. And I went to a county level hearing here in Portland, talk about a flavor ban.
Yeah.
And and the people who show up and the way that the press covers it
Yeah.
both reinforce this because you had two groups of people there basically in dueling T-shirts. One
Yeah.
was the prohibitionist, which I assume were Bloomberg funded,
Right.
and then the other group was like convenience and vape store owners.
Right.
And so all the press coverage about the debate, those are the two sides.
Yeah.
You've got like the noble public health people who want us to ban the products, and then on
Right.
the other side you've got these vape shop owners who want to keep selling these deadly products and don't want to go out of business. And it becomes a public health versus business story.
Mm-hmm.
And the two groups who are completely excluded are vapors and smokers themselves, and any of the like tons of very good scientists and public health experts who actually support harm reduction. They get
Yeah.
no voice in these debates. So it's
Well, it's true.
extremely
Although, but let's talk about the grassroots numbers, though. Setting the activism aside for a second, I mean, it strikes me when you look at the followings that some of our advocates, like Nick Green, has for his YouTube review vape reviews. It's in the six figures. I mean, it's significant. You look at the threads beneath a lot of the social media that advocates in our groups do, and it includes many ordinary people from all over the country, from all walks of life. And you contrast that with the social media of these highly funded professional activist organizations, and there's just nothing there. They have no followers. They have no commentary on their threads. Even for major announcements, they have to pay people to show up for their events. I mean, it's just all complete astroturf. And, it's hard. Like, I'd love nothing more than for vapors to show up at every hearing the way they did on the mall for the We Vape, We Vote stuff. But, they have other jobs and other pursuits, and they're doing productive things in their life. Matt Myers, this is all he does. Like, this guy's on a religious mission with a $25 million bank account behind him.
Yeah, and I don't think people realize how that shift has happened. Like, how much money there is now on the prohibitionist side.
Yeah.
It's no longer the days of the underdogs against big tobacco.
But they cling to that. They cling to that conceit, though, don't you? I mean, you can sense in the way they posture themselves that they're still, out questing against a giant dragon.
Right. When it's actually, multi-billionaire Michael Bloomberg, dumping hundreds of millions of dollars in campaigns to shut down, independent vaping shops in Montana.
Right. Although I'm sure he fancies himself, up against an underdog, just up against the system.
But he's had a really hard life. You gotta be sympathetic too.
You said another curious thing along these lines in the book, which was you characterized some tobacco harm reduction advocates as supporters of what you called Prohibition light. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. And, we think about this a lot too. AVM tries to create as wide and big a tent as we can for vape advocates. And even though we don't all see the issue the same way, but what do you mean by advocates that are Prohibition light?
Yes, this gets back to that technocratic mindset that I talked about earlier, where, especially people who are in academia or perhaps in public policy and who come from a progressive background, they have this tendency to think about what the ideal policy would be, or what the policy would be if they were in charge. And so the biases there are, one, you kind of make this assumption that the right decisions will be made because you're going to have the right people in charge, and they're not going to have other incentives distracting them. And two, that the policy won't have a lot of unintended consequences, and when you pass the law, it will be obeyed. And I think both of those assumptions are very questionable. The people in power are not you, not you yourself, Jim, but not you, the technocrat imagining what this perfect policy would be. And if you've been to local meetings like I have, or state level meetings, or even federal Congress, the people making these decisions aren't always the best informed. And they're facing lots of pressures. They care about being elected and reelected, more than necessarily care about making the right policy choice. And people at the FDA, they have their own pressures as well, their own incentives. And it's not necessarily to do what's best for the people or to respect other people's liberties. And then to continue that, like, even if you do get the policy result you want, which in this case for tobacco, I think most people would be saying things like banning menthol cigarettes or stripping nicotine from cigarettes, is then not really considering what the impact of that will be on black markets and on law enforcement, and just sort of hand waving that away and being like, oh, it's just another regulation, it's going to be fine. Which I think we're seeing in the states that have tried this it's going to be a lot harder than that.
Well, I can commend the piece you did just a few days ago in Reason about examining the Massachusetts flavor ban, and tell us about that. If I recall, you found it actually did very little in terms of accomplishing the goals on its own terms, and made all the problems it was aiming to solve demonstrably worse.
Yeah, it's pretty clear. Like, Massachusetts they were the first state to pass a flavor ban statewide on both e-cigarettes and cigarette, like basically every tobacco product you can name. It's illegal in flavors in Massachusetts. And they're also, in a way, very admirably transparent, where they call it the multi-agency task force, of all the police agencies and revenue agencies that are involved in tax collection there. They publish an annual report. And it's available publicly. It's, about 15 pages long. and it's a great resource because you can actually go in there and like read firsthand what they're doing, and they have the numbers, and the number of seizures of now illegal products are increasing year over year by dramatic amounts. My favorite, put that in quotes, my favorite part of the report is where they talk about their future challenges. And one of the challenges they mention is just running out of storage space because their warehouse is too small to hold all of the seized flavored tobacco products that they're taking away. It's just a clear demonstration that prohibition is going to be a lot harder than the technocrats think it's going to be. And so to go back to that, I would say I call it prohibition light, which is where we're picking and choosing the products we're going to prohibit, but we're going to allow the good ones on.
Yeah.
It's such a complicated message to get across to people.
Yeah.
Most people, including legislators, aren't going to get deep in the weeds of reading research papers.
Yeah.
An argument that is not complicated and that resonates with people, especially in the United States, where we have a strong tradition of individual liberty, is respect adult autonomy, respect people's right to choose. And so when people who have that more technocratic approach and want to prohibit certain products, do this prohibition light, I really think they're undercutting the arguments of the whole movement, because the strongest argument we have is not technocratic. It's that adults should be able to be free to choose.
It's funny. There seems to be, not only any sort of self-awareness about, the hubris in that view, or the possibility that it might be mistaken, or that others may differ with it, but also they seem oblivious to the futility of those policies. I mean, and this is again a through line that I've noticed throughout a lot of these progressive manias about food and beverage or entertainment. The regulations don't work on the face of them. I mean, just to take the Tipper Gore example, for example, they put they achieved putting the warning sticker on records. Okay, the parental explicit language warning sticker. That was their big legislative accomplishment. So they won. But guess what? The sticker's still there. It's still, but when you put that sticker on the product, it sells more of the product.
Right.
And the record companies perversely like it because they can sell those the tracks that have that sticker on it for more money than the redacted version of the song.
Right.
But there's tons of examples. I mean, again, going back to alcohol prohibition is the one most Americans I think are familiar with. But you'd think at some point, having touched the stove 100 times, they'd realize it was hot. Why? Please enlighten us. Are they so blinkered about the actual outcomes of the policies that they've devoted their whole life to achieving?
Yeah, and it's particularly astonishing where I live in Portland, because Oregon is arguably the most liberal place in the world for drug policy.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a great alcohol scene in terms of brewing, distilling, bars, whatever. We just legalized cocktails to go permanently. We were one of the first states to legalize recreational cannabis. We've decriminalized nearly all drugs. We're in the process of enabling legal psychedelic therapy. Like, you name it, we are a front runner, and yet we're banning flavored e-cigarettes statewide. That's a bill that's going on, and it's the disconnect is really astonishing.
But you'd think that let's just call it the Puritan movement or the prohibition advocates, you'd think that they would be horrified to see that the policies they're putting in place are leading to black markets, reduced taxation revenue, more access to young people, more people being hurt by adulterated or black market knockoff products. I mean, these are things that they seem to care about a lot. Why does it not bother them when they see those outcomes?
Yeah, I think it really just comes down to mood affiliation. They just don't like tobacco and nicotine. They have a very 1990s mindset about it, which I think is the case for a lot of people. Like, their image of nicotine and tobacco is the dishonesty of the big tobacco companies in the 1990s, and the small underdogs bringing the good science against them, and that's just not the case anymore.
I'm struck by you're making me think of something that we think about a lot, which is that so many of the kind of luminaries of the anti-vape movement, like Matt Myers, Bloomberg himself, Mitch Zeller, Meredith Berkman at PAVE, are all kind of that generation of 90s progressives, many of whom came, right out of Ralph Nader's movement. I mean, Mitch Zeller worked for Center for Science and the Public Interest. Meredith Berkman is the daughter-in-law of Morton Mintz, one of the greatest progressive journalists of the late 20th century. I mean, I guess it's a Twitter cliche to call that a boomer mentality, but it is pretty striking that all of these leading thinkers are all from that same generation, whereas, a lot of the folks that are in tobacco harm reduction seem, I guess, maybe a generation ahead of that. Am I making too much of that?
I don't think so. That's actually one of the things that's given me optimism, about, however bad things look in the short term for tobacco harm reduction and nicotine. I think there is that factor of generational change, and putting it bluntly, for science in general, not just for the issues we're talking about, but like, ideas don't always win by convincing people. Sometimes ideas win by the older generations retiring and dying off. And I think that is one thing that gives me optimism, is that once that generation finally retires or leaves the scene, we might have an opportunity for younger people to come in and be a little more objective about what the actual risk and harms of nicotine are, especially compared to other drugs that are available.
Well, if you'll indulge me, I want to push my own buttons for a moment and just to loop back on the journalism, and we're talking about sort of the obliviousness to the harms that are being caused. And as readers of our Twitter feed will be familiar, we are often trying to confront news outlets about slanted coverage and omitting voices from the tobacco harm reduction movement, or even from the vape industry, and even strikingly confronting them on factual errors like smoking gun, erroneous reporting. And so many of these outlets just, turn a blind eye is too gentle. They won't even engage with it at all. And I'm talking about places that posture themselves as responsible, transparent news organizations like the New York Times or NPR or Associated Press or Politico. We present them with smoking gun factual errors, clear breaches in their own journalism guidelines, and they just will not engage in any dialogue about it. That to me is a kind of willful, irresponsibility.
Yeah, it's that, and it's also just laziness. And
that's Occam's razor.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've confronted, and about almost 2 decades of writing about these issues is just, going back to the smoking ban debates and just reading articles that would come out on the topic and just being amazed at like, oh, this journalist is just lazy. they went to their one source.
Let me give them a little credit, though, because I suspect that a lot of the writers that are covering these issues, especially FDA beat writers, for example, actually have a kind of sympathy for the public health movement and the progressive assumptions of public health authorities, and they cover it in a sympathetic way because they share those values. Is that? Am I imagining that, or do you sense that too?
No, I think that's accurate for sure. Yeah, and again, it goes back to that 90s mindset of skepticism of big business and big tobacco in particular.
Yeah,
and one of the things I've been bringing up in interviews about the book is how you don't have to trust big tobacco, but you should just look at incentives. And the incentives that big tobacco had in the 1990s are drastically different from the ones they have now, and there's very good reasons for that. One. In the 1990s, all the science was against smoking. Big tobacco had no incentive to do or promote good science because it was all against them. That's no longer the case because now there actually are much safer sources of nicotine that consumers actually enjoy using, like vaping and snus and the long list of other harm reduction products. So that's one reason incentives have changed.
But it's interesting that this issue, tobacco harm reduction, I think it can be distinguished from a lot of those other food and beverage and entertainment campaigns that movement embarked on, because in this case, by depriving Americans of vaping, it's causing an active harm. So, if the public health movement likes the precautionary principle that we shouldn't put something on the market until we know it's safe, if that's one of their, moral lodestars, in this case, it doesn't quite work, because depriving Americans of that product means that they're going back to cigarettes. I mean, there was a paper that came out recently that had an estimate of, the life years that were being cost. I think Kasa had a tweet about it, which we'll put in our thread. But the point I'm making is that their policies, as they're being executed now, are causing active harm. And that to me, you'd think that a light bulb might go off. Like, if you stop eating Big Macs or stop drinking big gulps, nothing bad's going to happen to you. But you take vaping away from people, and they're going to go back to smoking cigarettes.
Yeah, and there's another person I've talked to who uses the analogy of Volvo cars. And comparing this to Swedish snus, two Swedish companies, and how Volvo was, a leader in automobile safety, and regulators follow suit, and talking about seatbelts. You could accurately say driving is an inherently risky activity. People do too much of it. Maybe we should outlaw safety features so people are discouraged from using it.
Yeah,
it would be a terrible argument. But we see this. But nobody thinks about nicotine use that way, where we say, hey, people are going to use nicotine. Maybe they should or shouldn't. Maybe it's not healthy, but some percentage of the population is going to do this. We should make it as safe as possible. And they don't take that approach.
An argument which resonates with them if you're talking about STDs or illicit drugs. Absolutely. Or they'll stand on a soapbox if they take the group Vital Strategies. They've got content galore sticking up for harm reduction in all these other areas, and yet somehow they've done mental gymnastics to disqualify vaping from that scheme.
Right, and they would obviously not be opposed to handing out condoms to encourage safe sex, but if somebody tried in the United States, which they're doing in Britain right now, of actually giving out e-cigarettes to homeless smokers to encourage them to take up a safer product, people would absolutely lose their minds in the U.S.
I promise this will be the last question on media criticism, but I want to make sure we don't lose it. It's one of the sort of white whales that we've been chasing at AVM is the way that a lot of these big progressive foundations are funding the journalism on this subject. And I'm talking Bloomberg, Robert Wood Johnson, Gates Foundation are giving big dollar sums. And it seems like every news outlet that we research, we find more of it. We started out, we found that Stat News, which is run by, ex-New York Times star Rick Burke, is getting untold sums. Then we discovered that NPR is getting money. I believe we found that at Associated Press is also getting money. And then most recently we discovered, Cameron will remind me in the thread here, but the point is they're getting tens of millions of dollars. CNN is getting huge donations also. I'm talking millions of dollars to cover this issue, of which the donors are like an active part of the topic. So we went to NPR's got a very well-respected public editor, an ombudsman, whose name is Kelly. She's with Poynter Institute, Kelly McBride, and asked her, hey, wait a second, this is seems like a cardinal sin in journalism. Could you kindly explain how NPR justifies taking millions of dollars from Robert Wood Johnson, which has an ideological and financial stake in the issue? They're investors in the manufacturers of Nicorette gum, and she wouldn't even engage with us. And then we looked a little deeper. Guess what? Her organization, Poynter Institute, they get money from Robert Wood Johnson too. And so I guess I don't know. You tell me. Are we chasing a white whale, or because that strikes me as like an absolute cut and dried, no doubt about it, journalism sin. But you're a journalist. I'm just a PR flack.
It's so complicated. On the one hand, I'm kind of in favor of anything that brings money into journalism right now because we need it. but yeah, and it's kind of like think tanks, which when I started out in the think tank world too, where there's self selection. Like I think most journalists are honest regardless of where the funding ultimately comes from, but it does affect who gets attracted to the position in the first place. So like I used to work in think tanks, and most think tanks are getting private funding, and so it doesn't work in the sense that you get at least on a good think tank. There are also plenty of front groups, but in general, you don't take money from X industry, and then you come in with the mindset, I'm here to promote X industry, and they're going to look over my writing and make sure I'm saying the right things. But it is more of a self-selection effect. Like, if you were a think tank who was getting lots of money from oil companies, then you might be the person who's skeptical of global warming, and so you're going to go work for that think tank. And I think it's probably more than an explicit quid pro quo. It's probably more like, hey, we're funding your journalism outfit. Find somebody to report on these issues, and then the person attracted to that position, they don't view themselves as conflicted, but they are someone who's probably going to be aligned with that sort of narrative more than say a journalist for like me for Reason Magazine is going to be.
I guess maybe we could find concurrence on this question. At the least, it seems to me those outlets should disclose in a shirt tail on those articles that they're getting funding from an organization that has a dog in the fight. I mean, is that asking too much?
I think if they're, especially if they're like quoting affiliated organizations, yeah. Like if they're directly involved, I would certainly agree with that. And I think you guys succeeded in like getting Stat News to get that added to to one of their articles at one point.
Yeah, they claim they had the shirt tail in there prior to us complaining, but there's some dispute about that. But I mean, at least they had the bare minimum integrity, to respond and engage with us. NPR, CNN, Associated Press have had nothing to say for themselves. It's just absolutely incredible to me. Let's switch gears for a second, because I want to talk about how we can, how our movement can be more persuasive and evangelizing. Our mutual pal Radley Balco, one of the great libertarian journalists on criminal justice issues, has a great saying he coined, which is that libertarianism happens to people. You go through your life and then you encounter, the boot of the state, and suddenly you realize, hey, wait a second. And I sense that libertarianism is happening to a lot of, ordinary vapors who may not have thought about politics or public policy or anything like that, but are suddenly seeing in stark relief just how authoritarian and oppressive agencies like FDA can be, and how the rantings of the likes of Dick Durbin can have an impact in their day-to-day lives. But I don't know. You tell me, how do you see the evangelizing for tobacco harm reduction? How should we be going about that?
For me, I think it's getting people on the left and progressives to like just think about this in a consistent way, and saying like, hey, you believe this when it comes to bodily autonomy on these other issues, or you believe this when it comes to harm reduction on opioids or sexually transmitted infections. Like you already have these ideas. How would you apply them to this case? And like, let me make you think about that. And so actually one of the things I've most enjoyed about writing on these issues over the years is like, I love publishing in Reason Magazine, great libertarian publication. But I'll tell you what I love even more is getting to make those same arguments in the Atlantic or in Slate. Slate especially.
You've written for The Nation, I think, haven't you?
No, I haven't gotten The Nation.
Okay,
but I've been in Slate, and it's definitely kind of mind-boggling for some of their readers when they suddenly see this like pro-vaping article come out, or an expose on secondhand smoke science. And so I actually really like getting articles placed in those kind of publications. And so I think that would be some of my advice is, sometimes you just got to take your byline wherever you can get it. And that means, in the case of vaping, that often means like a right-leaning website where you're largely preaching to the choir, and there's still good in that. But, try to write your arguments and get your pitches in front of, people at less friendly publications, and and a lot of the time it fails. Like there's
Oh,
a science editor who like rejected me for the longest time, uh, and then she left, and a new editor came in, and this new editor was like, "Oh, this is actually really interesting," and so that's how I ended up, writing all these articles for Slate. So
yeah.
it takes time, but it can happen.
Well, we try to pitch that stuff a lot, and it's funny the articles that have the most resonance are ones like the great piece that Mark Gunther did in Philanthropy magazine, going after Bloomberg, and
Mhm.
um, we also have a thread which we'll put up again of all the various national columnists and commentators who've written pro vape commentary, and it's incredible to me because it spans the entire ideological spectrum. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find another issue in American public policy that has that wide a range of concurrence. And so showing that to these larger establishment media publications, which I think kind of lean sympathetically toward the progressive outlook, has a huge impact. Far more than anything else we can say, or even ordinary vapors. I mean, that because it comes with the imprimatur that it's okay to cover it in this way.
Yeah, and one other thing that might be worth highlighting is I've personally seen people who are, like you said, wouldn't consider themselves necessarily libertarian before, might have been somewhat left leaning, and then their vape shop gets closed down or they lose access to their vapes, and they see this accurately as something that's being done to them by Democrats and by progressives.
Yeah,
Uh, and so I would highlight those people because they are actually being driven to the right, being driven to Trump,
yeah,
and like speaking for myself here, I as much as I disagree with Democrats on tobacco
yeah.
policy, like I endorse Joe Biden, I vote Democrat. I don't want to see these people moving to the right just be over this vape issue. I'd much rather see progressives and Democrats, take a harm reduction and liberal approach. And so yeah, it's part of my work is trying to convince people like you should be liberal on tobacco, and you're not right now.
Well, right. And listen, let me take a swing at the right. We've knocked progressives a lot in this chat, but we've had a very hard time persuading members of Congress, let's say, or leading publications that are associated with conservative movement to get on board. I tried to persuade a good contact of ours at Heritage Foundation, for example, and for a lot of right wingers, vaping is also anathema, and they have these kind of reflexive assumptions about it that it's lowbrow, and they have class assumptions. It also offends their, I don't know, sort of morally upright church going self-conception. I mean, there's a lot of
Right.
reflexive hostility that the conservative movement has toward vaping. Now, to be sure, places like National Review have been terrific. Wall Street Journal editorial board stuck up for us. That's great. But we've been banging our head against the wall at Fox News, for example, for I don't know 2 years now, and can't get the time of day. So there are parts of the right wing, conservative movement that are hostile. Tell me if you've noticed that too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's accurate. Like, there's certain Mitt Romney certainly would be a key example.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, he's one of my in many ways one of my favorite people in the Republican Party, but unfortunately, again, has this blind spot when it comes to individual liberty on vaping. Um, yeah, it is interesting. I was invited once to appear on the Tucker Carlson show, but it was to talk about menthol ban. They
Right.
definitely nothing about vaping, and I turned it down because I think he's an important person. But but I did at least get that one invitation.
But he's a fellow tobacco harm reduction advocate. He's got his what does he do? I think he uses the pouches, and he says positive things about nicotine all the time. I mean, there's no one else at that level who's saying things like that. Surely that's a check in his favor.
Yeah, I'll give him that one check, but it's outweighed by by a lot of other things.
What you just told us we should be preaching to where the sinners are.
Well, and that's the problem. Is like I don't want to give them someone like that the argument, and it sucks that if the only person we can point to making this case is someone like Tucker Carlson, who is abhorrent in so many other ways, and so we need other people on the right and on the left, to take up this issue.
Well, that's what I'm thinking too, and it's the reason I point out that so many of the columnists covered this spectrum. I wonder if maybe the vape movement needs to be kind of careful what we wish for, because we want to be ecumenical, and I think one of our greatest philosophical strengths and grassroots strengths is that we represent such a wide cross section of American voters in every economic strata and ideological leaning, and that to me is a strong movement. And if we get too kind of drawn into the magnetic pole of left versus right, we may cut off our nose to spite our face. I mean, on the other hand, we'd have more relevance and more leverage than we do now. But is that a Faustian bargain?
Yeah, it's tough, and it's always a hard question on where to draw that line. And I'm definitely sympathetic to the idea that you should talk to anyone who wants to talk.
Yeah,
for the most part. And
we'll take for example the new Congressional Harm Reduction Caucus that just cropped up, or the fact that the chairman of the Oversight Committee, Congressman Comer, is now going to be grilling FDA on its vape policy. Like I was very enthused when I saw that, and I think those are great things. And at last, we're getting some advocacy at that level. But on the other hand, both of those efforts were swiftly attacked by the Bloomberg front group armada, and anathematized as a right-wing project. So how do you view those? I mean, are those good developments, or do they need to be bipartisan or not at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're good, but yeah, I think they're good. Bipartisan would be better. I don't know how we get there. Yeah, I'm certainly not I don't want to burn bridges on on the right, or at least not most of the right. But for me, it comes down to being aware of how you're being used as a source, and just who you're dealing with. So if I get invited on a talk show or any kind of outlet, I always do a little bit of background check, and because there's a case for engaging with almost everyone if you can challenge them on their worst views. I don't want to be used as a distraction. For example, if Tucker Carlson had me on to talk about a menthol ban to send the message that Democrats are the real racists, I don't think I'm actually advancing the cause by playing that role, even though I think a menthol ban is a bad policy. But if I can be invited, on a left-leaning news show to challenge the host on their support for prohibitionist policies, then that's a very useful thing to do.
When we get around to pitching Democracy Now!, you'll be the top of our suggested guest
right.
list.
Yeah.
Well, you're making me think. Maybe we could take a page out of your friends in the liquor spirits industry. We did a long thread about all of the anti-vaping members of Congress, and I was astounded to see that a lot of them made their fortunes in liquor and wine and beer. The chairman of the Congressional Whiskey Caucus, he's the founder of the Congressional Whiskey Caucus, hates vapes with the heat of 1,000 suns. And it's infuriating. But we looked at the Whiskey Caucus, and sure enough, it's got this wide ecumenical, far-reaching, nothing gets members of Congress together more than throwing back some blended scotch. But there's a lesson, I think, for the vaping movement. The tobacco harm reduction movement could be just as ecumenical if we recruited it and it the bipartisan appeal of the topic was apparent to some Democrats.
Yeah, and I think where we might get that is if FDA starts overstepping and going after premium cigars, which is the one product in the tobacco nicotine space that I feel like nobody wants to touch. Even Beverly Hills was hey, we're banning all tobacco sales, but we can't put our nice cigar lounges out of business. That would be wrong.
Put a fine point on that. Why do you think that's so?
I think it's a class thing. People see cigar smoking as an upscale activity, and it is objectively less harmful than cigarette smoking, but certainly not certainly higher risk than say vaping or snus, or other forms of consuming nicotine. But yeah, people see it as an occasional celebratory thing to do, and I think a lot of people viscerally feel that that personal liberty argument, because either they themselves have occasionally enjoyed a cigar, or like their uncle occasionally enjoys a cigar, and they're like, well, no, of course an adult should be able to do that. That would be ridiculous to restrict this. But the hard part is making that connection to the same thing. Well, why should an adult be able to enjoy a strawberry nicotine vape then?
Well, listen, I mean, we've been appealing to several members of the Progressive Caucus, some of their leading luminaries. Like, for example, there was that great article in Filter magazine a few months back about how a local vape shop in Harlem had been, crushed by state and federal vaping regs. And not only did it crush a small entrepreneurial woman-run business, but the clientele of that shop was, probably the most ethnically diverse neighborhood in America. And many of those customers were, low-income folks, and they were getting off of cigarettes through nicotine vaping. And that was the calling of the vape shop owner. I mean, you couldn't script an example that would seem more appealing for a member of Congress from that district, who is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And we've been appealing to them like, hey, this is like, speaking of checking boxes, this has got every single one of your boxes checked. Please don't tell me that, Michael Bloomberg's hypnotic appeal is so persuasive that you are willing to abandon your constituents that are facing this.
Especially since AOC is a former bartender, we have that in common. And I'm like, what we do for a living is we make a toxic substance more appealing through flavor.
Yes.
That is our job at the end of the day. So, I feel like there should be some sympathy there.
You'd think, yeah. And maybe I'm waiting for the light bulb to go off. I mean, I think a key is something you said earlier, which is, trying to get some leading thinkers within that movement, let's just call it the progressive journalism space, to weigh in and say, hey, wait a second, guys, maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way. One of these sort of contrarian Matt Iglesias, Ezra Klein type pieces that says, pull the needle off the record player for a second here, because the way we've been driving this issue is problematic. And I'm hoping that if a piece like that might kind of shatter this edifice that's been constructed by Bloomberg et al.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much the hope of why I wrote my most recent book, was to get the idea out there in a packaged way. Obviously, I hope the book sells, because that means people are reading it and I make a small amount of money on it. But yeah, the ideal for me would be that some larger journalist runs with this idea and actually analyzes it a little more. Or
how about a Dick Durbin staffer, or an AOC chief of staff,
right?
Or we just need one or two light bulbs on Capitol Hill to go off after reading the book, Jacob.
Right. I would love it.
All right. Well, why don't we wrap it up there? Hold up the book again so our readers can see, our viewers can see it. Terrific. And we will.
You can knock this out in a day.
You bet. And we'll put the link to the book in our thread, and keep up the great work. We're obviously huge fans, and voices like yours are really crucial and very, very much appreciated. So thank you for making time and for all the great work you do.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It's really glad to be here, and thanks for having me on.
Okay, sounds good. We'll do it again. Thanks, Jacob.
Right. Sounds good. Bye.